Well, welcome everyone. This is Michael Sabia. I'm the director of the Monk School at the University of Toronto. It's a pleasure for me to welcome you all to this book launch, the launch of Teresa Kramar's Forgotten Values. I think every time we launch a book, I think it's a good day. And it's a cause, frankly, for some celebration. First, because it marks the long, long days and weeks and months of research that go into producing something as substantial as a book. And second, certainly, I think at the Monk School, because the books we launch and the work that we do, they're all a reflection of our collective commitment to engage with the world beyond the academy, to have an impact on the world beyond the academy. And certainly, Teresa has certainly done that, in my view, with this book. And if you permit me just a brief aside, I also want to say that I think Teresa has an impact as one of the university's really distinguished and great teachers. Every time she's in a classroom with students, those students leave inspired. And that's a very, very important contribution over and above the contribution of this book and the other work that she does in her research capacity. So just a couple of words about the book itself. As you know, it's a book about partnerships. And anytime, at least in my view, anytime a complex idea like partnership enters our common language and is not just used, but overused as much as the word partnership is, you know that that's time to worry. Time to worry because partnerships they're anything but easy, and they're anything but simple. They sound good, that's for sure. Pooling capabilities, creating new ideas. But in reality, as Teresa shows, I think very persuasively in this book, in the specific case of the World Bank and biodiversity partnerships, that it's really not that simple. That when culture and standard operating procedures aren't really aligned, that bureaucracy wins all the time. And reflecting my personal bias, that's usually always a bad thing. So this idea of partnerships is a complex idea, and the more we learn about it, the better. On that point, one of the other things that strikes me about the book is just how timely it is. And I say that because while the book has a specific focus, in my view, that specific focus offers a much broader and a very important lesson at the right time. And I say that because, there are so many different organizations, so many different leaders who are trying to use partnerships now to be more agile, to be more creative, to be more innovative, to tackle big social and economic challenges that are really beyond the scope of any one organization, and hence the need for partnerships. So that makes it timely. And in a similar way, I think we're also living in a time where, again, in a lot of organizations, we are all trying to reach across old-fashioned boundaries, like the distinction between public and private, or for-profit and not-for-profit. All these boundaries are eroding. And again, a lot of that involves this idea about partnerships and learning how to make them work. So, Teresa, let me just say on a personal basis, congratulations. I think this is yes, it's a very timely book, but it's an important book filled with insights on a subject that really, really matters. So once again, congratulations on behalf of all your colleagues at the school. And with that, Matt, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Michael. Really happy to be part of this event celebrating Teresa's great new book. It's backwards, but there it is. I'm Matt Hoffman. I'm one of the co-directors of the Environmental Governance Lab here at the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. And I'm going to get the discussion going today by providing a bit of a summary of the book for those that haven't had a chance to read it yet, although I'm sure after today's event, you'll rush out and get it. And this will help, I think, sort of make sense for the discussion. Then I'll introduce our two panelists and turn it over to them for a more in-depth and nuanced look at Teresa's great book. We'll have a bit of a moderated discussion after that and give Teresa a chance to say a few words. We're going to first talk about her book before we let her say a few things. And then we're going to turn it over to the audience for Q&A. And just as a reminder, you can enter a question in the Q&A function anytime during the event, and I'll be able to see the questions and we'll have them answered towards the end of the event. Before we get into the book itself, though, I'd like to begin as we so often do, and appropriately, with a land acknowledgement. The land acknowledgement is really important for, I think, all events, but especially for events like this. It's important to acknowledge both the specific peoples on whose traditional land we're meeting today, especially the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River, but also because contributing to forging a more sustainable world is ultimately one of Teresa's aims with this book. And it's an issue that connects deeply to the settler Indigenous peoples' relationship and our collective relationship and responsibility to the land and future generations. And I think this is especially poignant today, given that one of the implications of Teresa's arguments is that if we really want to protect biodiversity, we need to have more and more serious engagement with local communities, which in many parts of the world means Indigenous communities. And because Indigenous people face some of the most significant threats from unsustainable practices, and many Indigenous peoples are at the forefront of efforts and activism to address them, I'm especially grateful for our opportunity today to work on this land at this event, see it as an opportunity to think deeply about what it takes to improve the sustainability of our world. All right, so to the book. So I'm biased, but this book has a compelling story to tell, one that's both relevant to academic conversations and, as Michael intimated, it's really important for on-the-ground efforts to protect biodiversity as well. At its core, it's a rigorous examination of public-private partnerships, as Michael mentioned, organized between the World Bank, corporations, and civil society organizations that aim to enhance the protection of biodiversity. So public-private partnerships get thrown around a lot out there in the world, but they're a specific thing. They're formal arrangements between IOs and private actors, mostly firms and NGOs, but other kinds of private actors as well. And they're designed to implement and pursue governance efforts and projects in various sectors. They emerged in the 1990s in sustainable development space and as a new means of global governance. But they really exploded in numbers in the 2010s and became sort of a mainstay of sustainable development governance. And they really become a standard, right? There's something that we always talk about now, public-private partnerships, especially in the development and environmental sectors. And as Teresa writes, PPPs are the subjects of lots of analysis. When something explodes in the world of governance, the academics are close behind to try and figure out what it all means. But we see vastly different opinions across the academic commentary around PPPs. Some observers decry their role in the privatizing of governance. Others focus on the effectiveness, ineffectiveness question and whether they're actually doing anything. While still others see potential in PPPs to engage with complex social and environmental issues through an innovative and potentially flexible mechanism. Unfortunately, too few of these analyses look closely at how public-private partnerships actually function as partnerships. The relationships between the actors that are in the formal arrangements and how those relationships shape the effectiveness and impact of these public-private partnerships. And this is where Teresa's book comes in and really fills a serious lacuna in the literature. She zeroes in on the relationship between the World Bank and its partners in specific public-private partnerships to assess how that relationship influences whether these PPPs are able to achieve their potential and promise in protecting biodiversity. The partnerships are supposed to do three things, or at least the promise of them is surrounded these three advances. They're supposed to be sources of innovation and coming up with solutions to biodiversity loss and protection. They're supposed to contribute to the democratization of global governance. And they're supposed to bring in new resources or bring new resources to bear to help solve some of these problems. Do they? That question is especially important to ask of World Bank-centered partnerships focused on biodiversity protection. World Bank is obviously the single largest player in sustainable development, shaping policy and programming at many levels, even when it's not directly involved. And biodiversity protection is absolutely crucial. We're in the midst of the 6th global mass extinction event that the world has seen, at least that we know of. And we've lost, just as one stat, up to 50% of animals globally in the last few decades. In addition, biodiversity is something I would call a keystone environmental issue, with direct connections to other issues like climate change, pandemics, for something that's topical, deforestation, and food security. So are partnerships helping? And are World Bank partnerships helping? In short, and this isn't a mystery novel, so I'm not giving away the end. Teresa says no, or not enough, right? Especially not the ones orchestrated by the World Bank. In short, and I'll leave the discussants to tease out the argument in a more nuanced way, Teresa finds and shows through a series of compelling case studies that the bureaucratic logic and power of the World Bank vis-a-vis its partners is overwhelming the positive potential of partnerships. That's 5 Ps, the PPPs. The inertia of World Bank rules and procedures is limiting the ability of partnerships to innovate, democratize, and increase resources, even to the point of losing sight of the very values that drove the development of the partnerships in the first place. So it's a bit depressing, as you would expect from a book on biodiversity. It turns out that we're not governing that very well. Yet the analysis that Teresa undertakes in this book allows her to offer a few suggestions for improving partnerships. And there's the source of hope here, and the source of what I hope is impact on the ground for governance through partnerships moving forward. This includes 2 key suggestions, one around enhancing the autonomy of partnerships so they can escape the gravitational pull of the World Bank's bureaucratic inertia and truly democratize. And the second is to more truly democratize biodiversity protection by engaging more seriously with the communities that are on the receiving end of partnership projects. So with that, I hope that gives you a sort of a baseline sense of what the book is about. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our 2 discussants. So first we have Karin Backstrand joining us from Stockholm University in Sweden. Karin is professor in environmental social science at the Department of Political Science there. Her primary research revolves around global environmental politics, the role of science in environmental decision-making, the politics of climate change, and the democratic legitimacy of global governance. Karin's work has been published in journals like Global Environmental Politics, European Journal of International Relations, Global Environmental Change, Global Environmental Policy and Planning. There's a very long list here. Her latest books are the Research Handbook on Climate Governance, co-edited with Eva Lovbrand, and Rethinking the Green State, Environmental Governance Towards Climate and Sustainability Transition with Annika Kransel. Following Karin, we'll hear from our own Stephen Bernstein. Stephen is Distinguished Professor of Global Environmental and Sustainability Governance here at the university. He is a professor also in the Department of Political Science and co-director of the Environmental Governance Lab at the Munk School. He also co-edits the journal Global Environmental Politics and is a lead faculty member of the Earth System Governance Project. His research spans the areas of global governance and institutions, global environmental politics, non-state forms of governance, and international political economy. He is the author or co-editor of several books and the author of over 70 articles and book chapters, including Science, Nature, Climate Change, European Journal of International Relations, Review of International Political Economy, and a number of other distinguished journals. But I'm going to stop there and turn it over to the panelists to discuss Teresa's great book. Karin, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, and thanks for inviting me to this book launch. We need these fun things during this very depressing pandemic. So this is great to be here and joining from Stockholm. And first, I want to congratulate Teresa for her fantastic book. I will use my 10 minutes to see, to try to sketch what I think is both theoretical, empirical, but also extremely important policy contributions. I think this book should be in the hand of key policymakers in these international or multilateral organizations, because a lots of lessons to learn from this. And I agree, I mean, and it was an excellent summary of the book. I would say this book is extremely timely, and it's also, it's timely because partnerships and public-private partnerships or multi-stakeholder partnerships are promoted as a model of global governance and for multilateral organizations as never before. I will come into this. So therefore, the book is extremely important since it does this detailed process tracing of, and I agree with Matt says, it really, Teresa has this, she combines a micro analysis of the power and relationships in partnerships in detail, in these biodiversity partnerships, with the kind of macro trends of partnerships. And so partnerships today are advanced as this models of multilateral governance, and it's a very popular tool. And I think the first thing what makes this book so good, it starts in a paradox. And the paradox is this: we've had 20 years of research on partnerships, multi-stakeholder partnerships, and this Teresa summarized very well. I and others have contributed to this, and the kind of overall view, including the very critical account that Teresa gives in her book, it's very, in a way, on performance, legitimacy, partnerships do not deliver. But here is the paradox: despite of this, partnerships are continued to be advanced as models of governance. And I think a good book starts in that. And so my first reflection is this, and I start from that now we see in the UN system and also in the Agenda 2030 in the global SDGs, we see now how the UN system as a whole is arguing that we need now a new generation of partnerships aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals. And the UN itself really look on global partnerships and how to build with the private sector, with the civil society sector, sustained partnerships to actually scale them up and build these new coalitions. And therefore I think, and this is kind of the macro perspective, and here is Teresa's book very important because her detailed examination, and I really enjoyed this very this look into also these specific partnerships, her detailed empirical analysis of the microcosmos of partnerships. They are very, I think, these findings from the biodiversity and the World Bank can really be transferred to other policy areas, including the SDGs, and where the contribution of the book is so important, because how do partnerships work on the ground? What are the power relationships? So that's actually, I think, the policy implications, the policy lessons of this book is so important, and that we as scholars need really to speak truth to power here, which I think your book do. And I agree with Matt, it's a very, in a way, damning account, because what you basically say is that the partnerships, the World Bank partnerships, fail on innovation, on democratization, and on providing additional funding. And so these are extremely important lessons. So that's the first. The second big contribution is your theoretical contribution. So this book will attract interest for scholars on partnerships and global governance. We need to really carefully read this. I'm already so inspired. I will use this in my master students classes where we have we study multi-stakeholder partnerships and UN partnerships. So this bureaucratic model, or the sociological institutionalist model, is for me extremely convincing as an explanation to partnerships. The fact that international organizations as bureaucracies have interest, and the book gives an extremely plausible account of this explanation, that focusing on the principle and how UN, and we can see that in policy praxis now, as the funding for UN from member states are decreasing. Also, different UN organizations need to reach out to the private sector. They need to build new alliances, and they need to, and I've written about that, reinvent their own missions. And this is exactly what happens with the UN now in the Agenda 2030, when they say, and for me it's fascinating as researcher, when they say, now we need to build the new generation of inclusive, effective, public-private, multi-stakeholder partnerships that will deliver and make us achieve Agenda 2030 in 10 years. I'm like, oh, read Teresa's book now. But this model is very, this theoretical alternative account from principal agent you advance is very convincing. So I think this will attract a lot of discussion in the scholarly community. Thirdly, and I already hinted to that, your book is empirically rich. It really connects the microcosmos of what occurs within partnerships. This detailed assessment through interviews, through process tracing, to the macrocosmos of multi-stakeholder partnerships. And this, I agree with Matt, we need this stronger empirical foundation for what are the dynamics, why do partnerships work or not work? And again, you look on biodiversity, that really needs an attention, because now climate seems to crowd out many other environmental issues. However, of course, climate change is linked to many, but I think that is also a very good, that this book focuses on biodiversity. So I'm running out of time, but I actually have then two questions I want to bring up here. And one is actually where I'm not, this is probably the only point in the book where I'm not completely convinced, but I'm sure you can convince me. You talk about the three rationales for partnership as outlined by Matt, the democratization, innovation, and funding. Now, the first, and to take partnerships in defense now, I have not seen public-private partnerships or reading the literature. A rationale was never that they should be democratic instruments. Rather, the motivation was for them to be solving problems, perform. And as I have read the literature, a positive side effect could be inclusion through new coalitions, but that they should be a response, as you say, to that they should solve the global governance deficit. For me, it's not entirely convincing. However, it's convincing that the UN in themselves have had a rhetoric and narrative of partnerships as this win-win. And I constantly hear that myself in interviews, that they can deliver on, that they can be solve problems on the ground, that they can increase inclusion. But are really partnerships, and this is my question, were they really meant to help to democratize global governance? So, and I have, of course, more questions, but a second question is, and you touch upon this, but I would like to ask you about your reflections, and it's a bit forward-looking question of, again, which I alluded to, with declining member state funding and contribution to the UN and multilateral organization are really needing to reorient themselves to the private sector. And again, there has been a lot of critique of partnerships as this paving the way for privatization and neoliberal modes of governance. But how do you view this now as the House is running out of money, funding, so to speak? What will this apply when UN and multilateral institutions are really now orienting themselves to try to garner private sector funding? I mean, you touch upon this, but it would be very interesting, also reinforced by the COVID pandemic, as memberships budget will be strained. Is this inevitable, do you think? What are the dangers and how should we navigate in this? I think I've spoken my 10 minutes. I have loads of questions, but I hope I can come back maybe to one or more two, and I look forward to the discussion.
That's excellent, Karin. Thanks so much. Stephen, on to you.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm also really, really pleased to be here and to celebrate this great achievement, Teresa. So thank you very much for inviting me. Just, I'm thinking I'm going third, and some of you've heard a lot about the book, and I think what I'll try to focus on is maybe just drilling down a little bit more into the argument, but I will set a little bit of context first. And maybe just by starting off too, is that I could talk for a long time. I've known Teresa for a long time. I can't remember how many years, but over 20 years, is that right? No, yeah, about 20 years. Anyway, so for quite a long time, and seeing the development of the book. And I should just mention that one of the things that does impress me about this project is that Teresa really moves easily intellectually from her experience. I mean, this wasn't mentioned, but she worked for, I think you can tell us, Teresa, but 10 years in various international organizations, including with the bank. And what I think is one of the real strengths of this book is this kind of ease in which you can sense that experience and really understanding the inside of an organization, but also moving moving back with her kind of scholarly and academic hat on, standing back dispassionately to explain the patterns that you see, and to do that from quite a sophisticated academic and scholarly standpoint. Okay, so I'm going to dive in now, but you're going to see the way in which this plays out when we really think about, as people have talked about, the kind of practical implications of the book, which comes out very clearly and is a theme that runs through it. Let me add just a little, maybe further detail to what's already been mentioned about the importance of partnerships. Just before this talk, I had a look at the UN website on the Sustainable Development Goals, which I'm sure many people know about and have been monitoring. So when you go to the UN website and you look at sort of what's happening, and of course they mention states and so on, and states present what they're doing at the UN, but the dashboard of when you see what the actual action is on the Sustainable Development Goals, one of the big dashboards is on partnerships. And so they have some stats up there. They boast that there are 5,281 registered, well, they say partnerships or voluntary commitments. They kind of lump these things together. As you've heard, sometimes there's not clear boundaries between these different things. And then they mention how many have submitted status reports. 169. Okay? So 169 of those 5,000 have submitted status reports. About 1,000 have reports due, so they say they're going to do them. And then the rest, 3,549 to be exact, are more than 2 years overdue in their status report. So again, I think that this a book like this couldn't be more timely and more relevant in thinking about, okay, here we have partnerships by perhaps arguably the most important, well-resourced and influential multilateral development institution, the World Bank. And these should be the easiest to succeed. These should be the ones we would expect to do the best. Okay, these should be amongst those that are, highlighted on the website as doing a great job. And we should be able to look to the World Bank about, well, maybe some of these other ones aren't doing what we want, but here's where we should really see partnerships work. They should be able to deliver. They should be able to have the resources that they need, and so on and so forth. So if we're going to look anywhere, it's here to see whether they can work and what the realistic prospects of them doing so are. And this is really what Teresa asks, is why do partnerships turn out the way they do? And what can be done to improve them? So I don't think there's any better place to look than the World Bank. It's the baseline is very good. One of the things I really like about the way in which she approaches this question is that she doesn't start off as either a critic or as a supporter. Rather, it's a real puzzle. And I would state the puzzle, or as I understood the puzzle, it's actually just maybe slightly different than what Karen said. And maybe, Teresa, you can talk about this. You actually seem a little more sympathetic to partnerships than maybe your findings suggest, or maybe the way in which Karen suggests that, sometimes the critics say, well, nothing's good about partnerships. They don't really perform well, and so on and so forth. The way I saw you set it up is that some of the things that proponents say they should do, they actually do okay at, and your partnerships actually did okay, or some of them. I mean, she looks at 12 and then 2 in really close detail. So even though the overall story is not that great, they do something. So they've created new protected areas. If you measure it by hectares of forest being brought under certification standards, sort of being brought under these voluntary standards, they're doing pretty well. They do well in staff training as rangers to help manage resources in many of the partnerships, and so on. So some of these kinds of metrics that the World Bank might like to use, they can kind of check off, and yeah, well, we are doing these things. Some of these outcomes are the things that we want. And one of them that I found most interesting is that, the critics have complained that the ones that involve, and most of them do involve private sector partners, the concern is that this is going to lead to private sector partners running the show, or their interests being favored. And what Teresa finds is that private actors actually very rarely assume authoritative roles. They're not really the ones that are in charge of the partnerships. More often, in fact, authority, because of partnerships, and perhaps ironically, tends to move to states, if I'm understanding you correctly. So partnerships, although they're public-private, they actually reinforce the authority of the state. And the other big actors that tend to have a lot of authority are the big NGOs. So again, that's a really interesting finding that is kind of different than what we might expect if we just looked at the critics of partnership. Now, on the other hand, in line with the critics, they often perform poorly on key measures of the bank's own goals. And this is another strength of the book. She doesn't kind of set her own standard by which we should judge them. She says, what does the bank in fact say it wants to accomplish with these goals? They say biodiversity is going to be best achieved by democratic governance, by providing space for innovation, by greater financial resources, as we've heard. So they're sold on the ability to deliver these things better than other forms of governance. And that makes sense. I mean, these seem like good things. So how in fact do they do? Okay, so as we've heard on these 3 measures, they don't do particularly well. And I'm just going to skip around a little bit because we've heard a little bit about that already. So let me get to what she thinks actually goes wrong. So she does go over this various theoretical literature, and Teresa, you might want to talk about that, or you'll get some questions. She looks at principal agent theory. She looks at some of the literature on IOs and bureaucracy, and she comes up with really, I think, where she lands is this kind of sociological institutionalism sort of argument about sort of the culture of the World Bank. And I'm just going to quote her, since it's always better to quote someone than kind of impose my own view. What she says quite well, I think, is that the bank, quote, casts a long shadow, subverting organizational logic of partnerships and shaping them in its own image, which is risk-averse, hierarchical, bound to repeated rules and procedures, and functionally compartmentalized. So the same kinds of culture that exist in the bank are reproduced in the partnership themselves. And I think these factors are really superbly illustrated in several parts of the book, but particularly in one of the case studies, which is on the Critical Ecosystem Partnership Fund. And this is a fund, this is a partnership that the bank cites as a model of best practices. It was specifically designed to strengthen the involvement of civil society in conservation management. So that was the big selling point of this partnership. But what Teresa finds is that hierarchy, procedures, risk-averse behavior, and so on were internalized and really undermined this democratic goal. So small NGOs, stakeholders, they were engaged. It's not that they didn't sort of go ahead and try to engage them, but when it came to actual decision-making, where they could lead, where they were empowered, where their input would be listened to, and I think most importantly, where the idea of bringing them together to kind of promote this innovation and this kind of horizontal, ways in which to generate ideas that partnerships are supposed to be about, that didn't in fact occur. So ironically, what this partnership did end up achieving best was the operational goal of dispersing funds, something that the bank is good at, something that bureaucracies are very good at, but it failed to deliver on its primary goal of democratization. So she does something similar with the other partnership that she goes over in a lot of detail, which I won't talk about, but you can ask her about in question and answer. But the point is that the ways in which it's this organizational culture that really undermines, in the cases she looks at, the goals at which they're trying to achieve. Okay, the other, okay. One of the other things, one of the last big things that I want to talk about that I really liked about the book is that it actually looks at the policy prescriptions that the partnerships promote. Admittedly, I'm a little partial to this answer or to this question, what are they actually doing? One of my favorite parts of the book is when she quotes another great scholar of global environmental politics, Stephen Bernstein, who has noted that much of the literature, in some of my earlier work, this was one of the things I was interested in, has noted that much of the literature on global governance neglected precisely the question of what values or substance governance arrangements promoted. And instead, a lot of the literature tends to focus on sort of functional requirements for efficiency or even the question of effectiveness without asking effective at what, what are they actually doing? And Teresa confronts this head on. So, so she looks at the question of do they generate innovation, but she also looks at what values do the policies privilege. And what she finds is that bank partnerships really promote two sets of values, but not a third that they claim to promote. So or two approaches. So one is they tend to promote a very command and control approach. So it's very top-down, regulatory, now ostensibly informed by science, although often the science in these areas can be controversial or can be contested for various different reasons. But what it does is these partnerships are good at kind of promoting this idea that you should comply, this kind of compliance model of this sort of top-down decision-making, which of course, as she points out, is not great for involving local empowerment and so on. The second thing is that they've been quite, or some of them, a smaller subset, have been focused on favoring of market mechanisms, things like ecotourism, payment for ecosystem services, privatization of protected areas, with the idea that this can ideally generate revenue or compensate those who have to change their behavior for conservation. So these aren't necessarily bad things, but the tendency is for them to be sort of grouped around these traditional goals of the bank, the way in which their favorite approach is, even though the partnerships are supposed to explicitly be sympathetic to what is called community conservation, with this emphasis on local empowerment, accountability, and so on. So lip service is paid to this other sort of substantive goal, But in fact, it's very rarely achieved. I think of your 12 cases, only one of them sort of had this as a focus. And my sense is you were skeptical even there that there was lip service, but it wasn't really achieved. Okay. The toughest part of a book like this, and especially because we've heard that there are parts of it that are quite critical and so on, is of course the question, what do we do now? Teresa doesn't shy away from this question. The last chapter of the book tries to deal with this. Karin and Matt have both raised some good questions in regard to that. And I guess here I would just return to what you said at the beginning, Teresa, or what book says at the beginning, is that in principle, partnerships do aim to do these good things. And I think that you're quite clear about that. It's not that their aims aren't good. They do aim to do these good things. But we're concerned that we're relying upon them to do these things and they're not doing those things very well. And that then sort of raises a good question, which is the problem partnerships, or is the problem that the bureaucratic institutions that are often at the lead of the best partnerships, the ones that are models, the ones that you're talking about in your book, is it baked into those institutions that they're going to have these pathologies, or they're going to be unable to do it? I mean, you mentioned some business models, for example, that are possible solutions to this. Now, these business models of innovation have been around for a while. I'm sure people in the bank know about these, more decentralized autonomy for different sections of a partnership that might be working on things, so they can actually have that more horizontal framework. But is this just impossible when we have these large bureaucratic institutions with all their pressures of accountability, all their pressures of sort of operating in the way that they do? So to me, that was sort of one of the big looming questions in the background, and hope you engage with that, and I hope it provokes some thinking by other people in the audience as well. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you, Stephen. So now we've had a number of people talk about Teresa's book, and she's been very patient listening to hear other people talk about her book. And so we're going to give her a chance to say a few words before we start the discussion. Teresa, you can address the questions that have been raised or take things in an entirely different direction. It's your book. It's really up to you. I just do want to remind the audience that after we have Teresa's remarks and a few questions, we're going to turn it over to Q&A for the audience. And so we're using the Q&A feature. So it's a little box in the right-hand side of your Zoom menu. So, and you can type those in at any time, and then I will take a look at them. All right, Teresa, on to you.
Well, first, I don't know. I'm like gushing and saying thank you, because it is so nice to hear your reactions and to have this opportunity to just kind of have a conversation, and especially, Karin and I have been talking about this for a long time, and she's a leader in this literature. Stephen and Matt have been sort of partners all along, and have it's very special to be able to have this conversation with the three of you. And Michael, I couldn't be more grateful for your very kind opening remarks. So I think that you've captured you've captured the gist of it all, and you have at times responded to each other's questions. But let me just maybe highlight a few things that are takeaways from your comments for me. So yes, my argument is primarily structural, right? That despite the best attempts, so it's not about evil intentions. It's not about, and I do think actually that that accounts of the World Bank that paint everything with a broad brush actually miss a lot of the interesting nuance that happens, and a lot of the independence that does exist at the operational level to try and take on certain projects or promote certain initiatives, launch particular partnerships. Some partnerships are very top down, and the president of the bank says this is a great idea, let's do, and then the operational staff have to pick up that and say, okay, what is it? How do we make sense of this? Like World Wildlife Fund and the World Bank worked on a forestry partnership like this, and so my interviews were with staff who said, okay, well, what do we do with this, right? But others are bottom up, and one of the cases is the Global Invasive Species Program, where one of the task team leaders, who was a biodiversity specialist at the bank for a very long time, was completely committed to this partnership, and despite the best attempts of these individuals within the bank, the logic of bureaucracy takes over. And I'll see a little bit about the importance of risk aversion and trust in shaping some key critical junctures for partnerships. So yes, so it is this structural argument. I think you're absolutely right in identifying that some ways out of this conundrum are enhancing the autonomy of partnerships and truly democratizing by engaging with local communities, as opposed to for the bank to become partners with the 5 largest conservation organizations, which are easy pickings, right? They have AAA, Oracle financial books. They are very low risk in terms of reputational, potential reputational risks. They are also well known, right? They're well known not just as organizations, but there's this revolving door between the World Bank and large international conservation organizations. So they have staff routinely interact, but they also have different positions within the bank and these organizations. And I mean WWF and Conservation International, the Nature Conservancy, World Resources Institute, but particularly I would say TNC and CI. So it's not that this is an anomaly, because you would expect scientists who are working in biodiversity conservation to be interacting, dense relationships. But what's interesting is it doesn't go beyond that, right? That there is very little uptake of very good and prestigious conservation organizations in other parts of the world. So certainly there is scientific knowledge and expertise beyond these conservation organizations that are in Washington, D.C. And I posit that there is a problem with trust, right? That there's a problem with trusting what, and that this has to do with the bureaucratic culture of the bank. There's a problem with, and there's a very real concern with reputational risk for the bank and what it would take to then hand over the reins to local organizations for them to decide what counts as the problem, what counts as the biodiversity problem, what is the biodiversity worth conserving? Is it the hotspot approach? Is it a different kind of biodiversity that's actually more locally meaningful, and that the bank can orchestrate? And I can talk about orchestration in a second, which is Ken Abbott's and Snidell's program on the role of international organizations in partnerships. But so I'll just, I make the argument in the book that just not everybody has access to the kinds of relationships that create trust between the World Bank and civil society. So maybe I can just tell you a little anecdote. In the Critical Ecosystem Partnership Fund that you mentioned, there's comes out of this relationship between Pete Seligman and James Wolfe, And so then, for example, these two men describe where they met, right? They become friends. They go on fishing trips together in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. And during the trips, these fishing trips, they talk about developing the relationship between Conservation International. Seligman was the CEO of Conservation International, and the World Bank, where Wolfensohn was about to become president. So Seligman says, you and I met Jim at a dinner. We became friends. And then I think you're offered the position as the president of the World Bank. We went fishing. We were talking about ecological hotspots, which is, by the way, a brand, an approach to doing biodiversity conservation, among many other options, but this becomes dominant in this partnership. So we talked about ecological hotspots, about your role and what you're going to be able to do. And so then the two men go on to describe how Wolfensohn wanted to change the face of the World Bank, which has been seen as an adversary by the NGO community. And Seligman stood up to criticism for partnering with the bank. So Wolfensohn says, this is a tribute to Pete, right, to Seligman. He was prepared to stand up there and say, I'm prepared to deal with the World Bank. You remember, Pete, that's where a lot of people who were critical of you came out because of what you said. And so Seligman says, I was invited to a whole bunch of meetings by the NGO sector in that period, talking about 50 years is enough, 50 years of the World Bank is enough, and that we should come together to have the bank disband. And of course they disagreed with that. And I was really attracted, Jim, to your personal interest and passion for doing the right thing. I thought, here's someone whom I could not only be friends with, but someone whom I could really partner with. And so I suggested to the bank put in $100 million into this. So that's not the access that actually local organizations in developing countries where most of the biodiversity is actually housed have to neither the World Bank president or World Bank staff and it's not the kind of trust making that allows for the kinds of partnerships that enable horizontal decision making, that enable much more organic arrangements that don't depend on hierarchy and rules and procedures, and this is a problem. So trust is a problem. And then maybe the last thing I'll say is that you're right, Stephen, that I find that partnerships fail to deliver on the values that they were ostensibly set up to promote. And these values, I mean, Karen talked about democratization. So I do this archival research from 1968 till 2012 in the world, before the bank actually opened up their data a lot more. So in the bowels of the World Bank. To look at the kinds of justifications that have been offered. So 68 is where the Pearson Commission, which is the first kind of naming of partnerships as a thing, as a concept, where the concept kind of it starts to become part of the lexicon of the World Bank, comes up, and democratization is, you know, putting clients in the driver's seat, and inclusion and ownership is very much part of the rationalization of why partnerships. Why do we need partnerships instead of having multilateral development projects like we always have? So it's true they don't deliver on these values, right? On these democratization, innovation, and enhancing resources for biodiversity. But they do actually empower certain managing actors, and these are the managing actors that they trust. So in the case of the Critical Ecosystem Partnership Fund, they empowered Conservation International to be what Barnett and Finnemore call authorities in authority, to have the interpretive authority and autonomy to be able to say, this is what counts as biodiversity. This is where we find it. This is the policy. This is how we implement it. Now let's go out into developing countries and say, these are this is the menu of options, right? So you can apply for funding for projects that fulfill these objectives, but that's a pre-cooked recipe. That's not, there's no accountability, if you will, for why those policies and not other policies should be implemented. And And there's a lot to say about how the sort of the regulatory top-down command and control fortress conservation approach that that is most dominant in biodiversity conservation. There's a lot to say about how that has not worked. And so if there is a place that needs policy innovation is biodiversity conservation. So these partnerships actually don't deliver on these values. They do empower certain managing actors. And so when international organizations are kind of proposed as orchestrators of, because there's now a very, there's a very dense space, there's a very dense constellation of development actors. And so there is a crisis of relevance for international organizations. What's the role of the international organization? And some have argued that they would be good orchestrators of partnerships. But my concern is that if these partnerships actually are empowering certain managing actors, whether international organizations in fact are not orchestrators, but are being orchestrated through what's being done in practice, right? Maybe I'll just stop there and I'll just allow for some questions so I don't speak too much. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Teresa. That you've given your panelists quite a bit of food for thought, and I think the whole audience. And so I'm going to give people a chance to write some questions, and but I will start with my own. And this I'm going to push you a little bit on something that brings together, I think, two of or one of each of Karin's questions and Stephen's. So Karin asked about the implications moving forward of turning even more to the private sector. And Stephen, to paraphrase, asked, is the partnership the problem or are the partners the problem? And I want to ask you to reflect on that a little bit. And would it be better if the organizational logic of other partners dominated rather than the international organization's organizational logic dominating? Is it possible for PPPs to move beyond the organizational logics of the members? You sort of intimated there with your last comment that IOs are being played in some ways. And so maybe it is like, I guess when I read your book through its various stages, that I had the idea in my head that the partners were the problem, not necessarily the partnership, but I'm wondering if that's the case. I'm wondering if this mode of governing, it just has some fatal flaws that would be tough to contain, which is a really important thing to think about if we're going to start transferring these things to the even broader efforts to pursue the SDGs.
Thank you. It's bureaucracy is the problem, and it's the solution for some things. It's just that you can't ask what's the expression in English? Like you can't ask pears from the nut tree, or how do you say it? What's the expression? You can't ask the wrong thing of bureaucracy and expect it to deliver on it, right? So so when international organizations are worried about risk and are frankly overburdened by having to, monitoring a partnership or working with partners is no small feat. It takes a lot of effort, a lot of a lot of supervisory hours, and for task team leaders. In terms of resources and in terms of reputational risk, like you could be getting it wrong. Like that's what learning looks like, right? Getting it wrong too. So I think that shapes who gets to be a partner, and it curtails the kinds of policy scripts that might come out, and also who is going to be willing to put some more new money on the table, right? Because the partners are sort of pre-cooked by the concern with risk and the capacity to actually deliver at the level at which, for example, the Critical Ecosystem Partnership Fund does deliver in terms of operational metrics that speak to donors. So it is a problem of misalignments more than putting the fault on. It is about the partner. It is about the partnership. It's about the organizational makeup of the principal, if you will, in this case. So yeah, and when I say IOs are being played, I also I want to remove some intentionality from it all, right? I think that when NGOs have an opportunity to really push their mission and vision, and this is pretty tempting. So if there is an opportunity to really go out there and spend millions and millions of dollars according to how you think biodiversity should be protected, which also enhances your institution, and you are a non-governmental organization that depends on this, space and visibility. I think that it's almost it would be intuitive to expect that these NGOs would sort of use that hand. So that's why in the book I do talk about principal agent dynamics and agent slippage. When agents kind of take advantage of principals. But I don't think it happens exactly in the sort of linear way in which principal agent models actually describe. So I think that there is more interaction between the problems the principal has as well. I'm reverting back to a rationalist account, even though we have been speaking heavily about, organizational and sociological accounts.
Great. All right, well, I've got 3 great questions here on tap. Let me start with this one. Well, first, there were some nice words. Thanks, Teresa. I'm really looking forward to reading the book. Could you reflect a bit on the relationship between partnership effectiveness in relation to the role of World Bank country level offices? Have you uncovered some observations about the culture or sociology of World Bank country level offices that lead to better or poorer partnerships and their effectiveness?
Yeah, it's interesting. Thank you, Chris, for the question. I find that was one of the big differences. So in doing this research, I found this was one of the big differences between United Nations Development Program initiatives in partnerships and World Bank partnerships, is that there was a lot more devolution organizationally. So the UNDP gave a lot more leeway to country offices to work with national authorities and local stakeholders to frame the problem, right? To from the beginning say, okay, what is the problem from your perspective? What is the biodiversity loss, and what is causing it, and how is it affecting the goals of sustainable development, both at all levels, so at the local level, national and global level. And so I think that that is that working closer to the ground, closer with communities, and with autonomy, with a certain degree of autonomy at the country level is an important way forward. So I realize that this, that there's always this tension between having too much fragmentation and having a coherent biodiversity strategy at the global level, but in that equation, I do find that UNDP partnerships, and this is not what I get into in the book. I don't talk about UNDP partnerships. This is just on the World Bank. But in my experience, country offices in the United Nations Development Program and in the United Nations system have a lot more leeway to be able to. They're still quite prescriptive. Like, this is the kind of funding that you can get out of the Global Environment Facility. So you have to actually do this or this or this, but there is more of a conversation. There's more inclusion and representation.
Great. So this next question is about the sort of, if there's a northern bias in partnerships. Based on your description on the current resources and partnership allocation to different states or NGOs, what would be the solution to engage all states and NGOs from around the world and not only the developed world? Is this related to the democratic legitimacy of platforms like the World Bank? Do you see a Northern bias in the partnerships?
Yes, very much. So in the book, I actually, I'm explicit about the ways in which the partnerships are conformed in very Northern bias ways. So where they're headquartered, who gets to host the secretariat, who gets to be the chair of the partnership. So one of the conditions, and as I think all of you touched on, and partnerships mean everything, right? So one of the first things that I do in the book is really try and circumscribe, okay, what counts as a partnership for the purposes of this study? And one of the conditions for it to be a case in this book is that they have to create a governing institution. So they have to be institutional partnerships. They just can't be declarative statements, right, between partners, but they have to create an institution that can govern the partnership and can actually make decisions on what are the values, what are the metrics, what are the accountability mechanisms, so who gets to be, again, the managing partner of that institution, who gets to, whether it's, who gets to actually even have a say in the governance of the partnership? Is it a stakeholder model? Where if you're affected by the activities of the partnership, you get a say, or is it a shareholder model where only if you put money in the partnership, you actually get a say in how it's designed? And in all those metrics, it's quite Northern focused. I mean, it is a perspective of and it's also a perspective of biodiversity that is really biased towards and solutions to ecosystem damages and biodiversity loss. It is really quite solutions that come out of an experience in North America with protected areas.
Great. All right, so this one, hello, Prof. I'm looking forward to reading this. From what I've heard discussed, to what extent do you explore the idea that certain structures like business models, partnerships, etc., have inherent risks, and can they be structured out? In what direction, or what are the correct mechanisms that apply, from in situ reporting, disclosure, things like this? What is there a way to address the inherent risks in these partnerships?
Well, I'm dealing with one inherent risk, which is when you have a very large, mature bureaucracy leading that partnership, you have to be very self-conscious, intentional in creating some autonomy. In putting, and I do give a couple of examples of like Xerox PARC or other business organizations that have actually created, wherever you were going to have innovation was going to be very far from the mothership, right? Or even architectural decisions to create ways in which people were in buildings were going to have to be bound to bump into each other. So very intentional to try and override the proclivities of bureaucracies to silo, to revert to standard operating procedures, et cetera. So I think that in terms of bureaucracy as the inherent risk, those are some things to think about. I'm not sure if I answered that question, Matt. Did I get at everything?
I think so. Yeah.
Thank you.
And the questioner said yes.
Okay.
So this is a question less about the substance of the book and more about the process, and giving you a chance to reflect, and also they ask you to talk about the nice things in a book writing process, and you could also, I suppose, talk about the ones that aren't as nice too. Why did you decide to frame this research through a book? What did you most enjoy about the process?
Oh, what I love the most about any of the research for me is just talking to people on the ground. Like, what is the opportunity to just kind of hear from the perspective of those living with the issues that I'm fascinated by. So talking to people who are in the bank as sort of the at all sorts of different levels. So what is the view from all sorts of different places within the bank? Because it really gives you a much more nuanced picture than think of the bank as this homogeneous organization. To speak with staff and partnerships, and then of course with like, if you will, the end user, right, the beneficiaries on the ground. That is for me the most exciting part of doing research, is to just, you know, triangulate all this archival research and you know, data sets that you find on, like, you know, where are partnerships emerging, why are they emerging here, to the actual experience of people who are living with the practice of partnering. And then I'm like you, Matt, a very social academic. So I really like to just talk with you guys. I mean, this is to me like one of the most enchanting parts of the process, is to actually be pushed and you know, sort of go like, why did I make that choice or whatever. So I love that part.
Excellent. I like that part too. So we're coming to the close here. I want to see if Stephen or Karin want to have any last words for Teresa.
Can
No?
I add one more thing, Stephen? Sorry, I'm so sorry. Because both you and Karin had touched on this about the privatization of nature through public-private partnerships, and I don't know that I actually addressed that. It is true that, at least in the biodiversity space, what these partnerships show is, and again, this has to do with trust, either international organizations or NGOs, you know, these big managing NGOs, revert back to this, you know, command and control approach. This idea that nature is best preserved when people are kept out and wildlife is kept in, and the two have actually not evolved that way, right? There's been this human nature interaction always. And in fact, many of the, you know, biodiversity's best stewards actually have been indigenous communities. That should not be romanticized, but it actually needs to be acknowledged and you know, acknowledged in different ways, not just verbally, but also taking account of what it is that they are doing for, locally doing for all of us to have global benefits out of you know, this local action. So I have not found in the biodiversity space that market mechanisms have emerged as dominant. I know this contrasts in some ways with climate change, but in biodiversity, the state is firmly in the driver's seat.
Excellent. Stephen or Karin?
Karin here.
Karin, go ahead. Yeah.
Yes. So thank you for this. I really enjoyed this 1.5 hours. I realize we are running out of time, so I'm actually posing a question for future research, or for all of us, that I think is very important in relationship to your book, that I'm thinking of a lot. And that is, as I said in my introduction, partnerships are alive and kicking. The UN system will continue to use them. And as Stephen said, we now, with Agenda 2030 partnerships, with the Global Climate Action Agenda, we see this world of voluntary commitments, public-private, flexible modes of governance. And how do we need a kind of MRV for these, as monitoring, review, and verification? And that raises issues about accountability. Do we need to track more through formal accountability mechanism these partnerships, and whether they fulfill their promises and deliver? Now, you have done this, you have tracked the World Bank biodiversity partnerships in your book, which is a very important contribution. But I think important research area is, do we need proper accountability mechanism of these special creature of these soft co-governed voluntary partnerships? Do they live up to the promise? So I just throw that out as a future research avenue. Thank you so much for inviting me. I really enjoy this. Even if it's late, I'm very energized. So that's a good sign of a fantastic seminar or book launch. Thank you.
Stephen?
Yeah, first of all, just so I don't forget, I mean, yes, it's been a great discussion, and yeah, real privileged also, Karin, to have you here and have this kind of conversation. So it's been really wonderful. Just in terms of your question, Teresa, I don't have a great answer, but I am thinking of Karin in particular, because like you, she sort of has framed things. It's not the exact same framing, but you know, sort of, well, we'll just use in your case, but the command and control, the market mechanism, and the community conservation, and Karin is slightly different categories, but I think your civic, sorry, I can't remember what it's called, the civic engagement category, civic environmentalism that Karin has identified as one of the discourses. I think that kind of matches up with the community conservation. So I haven't done the research on biodiversity to say which one is dominant or not. My kind of lay overarching view is that your finding is very interesting, the partnerships you look at, that there is this kind of, especially when the big NGOs are involved, a kind of reversion back to this, you know, protected areas and so on, as some of the older traditional ideas about conservation. But I would say that in the discourse anyway, and in other programs, maybe we're not seeing as much in the partnerships, certainly payment for ecosystem services, for example, is hugely prevalent. And we see it manifest in all kinds of different ways. I mean, everything from kind of REDD, which is overlapping with climate, but to in the biodiversity space, in what's happening in the convention and so on, and the way in which this is being promoted in various programs and so on. And many countries, including Sweden, as Karin knows, I spent some time in Sweden, and you talk to academics in Sweden, and this is all they'll talk about is payment free, not everybody, but many will talk about payment for ecosystem services and so on. To me, one of the things that the way you approach it, and in even asking the question, is there's a kind of underlying question, which is, what do you want to achieve with whatever it is, with partnerships or with kind of the governance arrangements? And I think that, you know, for some of these NGOs, I mean, everyone says they want to achieve biodiversity, and of course that's right. But we know that there's also other values that are to achieve. And there's a kind of assumption that all these good values go together. You know, democracy and empowerment goes with biodiversity, goes with, you know, having people with good livelihoods and so on and so forth. And I think that one of the things that you point out is that it's taken for granted, and then there's kind of reversion, but the way we do things, or the way we have done things, is the right way to go about achieving all these wonderful things, and not really looking at the ways in which these different things actually interact. And it's the same thing for people who are promoting, you know, payment for ecosystem services, for example. All these good things will go together. And frankly, even for community conservation, that's going to be great. Different communities know how to, you know, achieve whatever, you know, their own goals and preserve resources. And I think what I think one of the implications of your study is to say, well, let's actually look a little more carefully at what the goals are. And it's not that one necessarily trumps, but that we have to keep in mind what it is we're trying to achieve here. And that might mean some tougher discussions about how to achieve it, and whether or not there's going to be, everybody might not win from achieving some of these things. And if everybody doesn't win, then what does that mean about actually what kinds of things we have to do to ensure that if some people don't win, that they're going, that we're going to take their needs into account, for example. But I think there that anyway, to me, that's where one of the things you're honing on, you don't talk about it as explicitly, is with any of the approaches, how do we keep those primary values driving the process, and not just assume that all these good things go together, which clearly you've shown that they don't.
Teresa, a final reflection from you?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much for these final thoughts from both of you. I think that this is so true, Stephen. What is the value added of public-private partnerships? Why not keep going with traditional multilateral projects? What is it? What's new that they bring to the table that couldn't be done in the traditional multilateralism? And then, Karen, as you said at the beginning, like, if they're not actually delivering, why even continue with these PPPs, right? And you yourself have offered some ideas as to why PPPs maintain, keep growing despite this. Different studies showing that they're quite limited on delivering on their that their performance is quite limited. So it might be questions of isomorphism, but it might be questions, as you were saying, a legitimation strategy, Karen, by international organizations. I guess what I want to push in this book is that the question of what are the right metrics for evaluating the performance of PPPs, right, of partnerships or multi-stakeholder multi-stakeholder initiatives, as you're saying, Stephen. So it's if it is, and what I'm trying to suggest is that there are feedback loops that when you undermine democratic decision making, you're also shooting yourself in the foot if the only thing you care about is saving a species, because it has no continuity past a project end date if you don't actually involve the people who are closest to the issue, and they have some decision making and and they themselves can demand accountability for how the partnership is involving them. So how do we think about evaluating the performance of partnerships ties very much into what you said, Karen, of whether we actually need to have a monitoring review and verification mechanism for partnerships before we keep kind of having this irrational exuberance around them. And I thank you very much for all your comments and questions.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to bring things to a close then. I want to thank Michael and the Munk School for hosting this book launch, and to Karen and Stephen and the audience for a stimulating discussion, and mostly for Teresa for writing such a great book and giving us the opportunity to have this discussion and to have a bit of a celebration, even though we're not all here together, to celebrate the launch of this book. Thank you all for coming. I hope you enjoyed the discussion. I certainly did. And thanks again to Stephen and Karen for their wonderful comments, and Teresa for a great book. Enjoy your afternoons.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.